program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The distribution of income in the United States is allegedly becoming less equal, and inequality has become one of the most contentious political issues in our nation. How should people think about equality? Does equality of outcomes or equality of opportunity matter more? Does an unequal distribution of income or wealth necessarily indicate that our society is unfair or less fair now than it has been in the past? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about an exciting project we have underway here at the Johnson Center and providing some different ways to think about inequality is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Steve Miller, who holds the Adams Bibby Chair of Free Enterprise at Troy University. Steve, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dan.
So before we get started, talk about inequality. Tell us a little bit about this project that you and GP Manish have underway.
So we are editing a book. GP and I are writing chapters for the book, but we have several other authors who are writing chapters for this book, and it's going to be sent out to academic publishers early next year.
And it's going to be providing a number of different, views or insights on the inequality debate, right?
Yes. Specifically, the book is on classical liberal perspectives on inequality. So it's a number of well-known classical liberal economists writing chapters, different perspectives, different takes on the very important issue of economic inequality.
Well, you mentioned, clearly it's one of the most one of the most heated topics of debate right now, and there are lots of different elements of this whole debate in terms of is the actual distribution of income becoming less equal than it was in the past, and is there still the same ability to move between income groups as we had in the past? But if you wanted to start to think about this, a lot of times people talk about inequality, but they're going to conflate almost two different, actually conceptually different things, inequality and poverty, right?
Yes, very much so. So the science of economics has always been interested in the question of poverty and driven by a desire to reduce poverty and lift people out of poverty and learn what it is that lifts people out of poverty. That was Adam Smith's central question in The Wealth of Nations, was trying to understand what it was that had lifted so many people in Britain out of poverty in a relatively short period of time.
In another related issue about often probably a misconception that people might have of the economy is that a lot of times people think that economic activity is a zero-sum game, which in which case disparities in income really sort of probably indicate that some people are being hurt or being left out, because if you're playing a zero-sum game and if we were playing poker and you win a lot of money, well, it has to be coming at my expense. And so therefore you could look at some people who are fabulously wealthy and you could infer that they must be getting wealthy at the expense of others in the society.
Right, absolutely. The inference is that because LeBron James is being paid so much, that means somewhere in the country, some firefighter or teacher or someone must be paid less. And that's not how an open market economy works. That's not how competition works. But that is how so many of our other things in life work, right? When we get home and we make dinner for our families, there is only so much food to go around, and it's a zero-sum situation. And like you said, if you play poker or you play most sports, right, there's a winner, and if there's a winner, that means there's a loser. So either someone gets more, which means someone gets less, or there's a winner and there's a loser. But that doesn't fit when we talk about economic activity, especially voluntary exchange.
Because we're actually producing new wealth, and everybody literally can be better off.
Exactly. More is created. It allows people to move beyond what they could produce for themselves and consume more. And have better health and more education. More of all of those things can actually be produced if people specialize and innovate.
Even in a situation where we have what would be a traditional zero-sum game, like say in football, we can sometimes see disparities in outcome, and we don't necessarily immediately infer that there's something fundamentally wrong or unfair about the process. I mean, if you were to look at like the distribution of college football championships in the United States over the last decade, it's highly skewed. It's probably a lot more skewed than the distribution of income in the United States, with the University of Alabama winning I think 5 of those championships over that period of time. So, and especially here in Alabama, probably very few people would look at the Tide's success and think there's anything wrong about it. But even still, we would look at a situation like this and say, well, there's not necessarily, even though it is a zero-sum game, when Alabama wins, that means like Texas or Clemson or other schools can't be winning. But even still, we wouldn't necessarily have a problem with by looking like, well, Alabama's won too many championships here or something, right?
Right. I suppose some people might argue that. They would really just look at outcomes and say they don't like how the outcomes are skewed. But most people care even more about fairness. Is this something that resulted from a fair process? Is this something that resulted from a just process? So there are differences between fairness or justice and then observed unequal outcomes, because it certainly is an unequal outcome. So football is a very good example, and there are a number of examples like that. The New York Yankees have won more World Series than any other franchise, more than double the number of wins by the St. Louis Cardinals and the Athletics. So that's another good example of the question between, or the tension between fairness versus unfairness, or unfairness versus inequality. They're not necessarily the same thing, and that's something that some of the chapter authors delve into. Is it about an equality of process, equality under the law? Is it that we're all playing by the same rules that people care about? That is the important notion of equality, or is it about people that have relatively similar outcomes?
Yeah, because clearly, Alabama plays in some sense by the same rules as other schools. They have 85 scholarships. They get to have the same number of players on the team. They all have the same abilities to recruit the same players. In fact, I mean, a number of schools actually have much bigger football budgets than Alabama, but just, we don't see equal outcomes. So,
right.
You mentioned the word classical liberal, and so I think for a number of our viewers there might be a little bit of confusion about what exactly this term classical liberal means. So I think that before we get into some more of the actual details of some of these views, tell us a little bit about who classical liberals were.
Okay, so you have to go back 200 to 300 years. When there was the emergence of a classical liberal movement, especially a little over 200 years ago. The founding fathers of the United States, for example, many of them we would now call classical liberals. At the time, they might have called themselves liberals. That's why it's called classical liberals,
right.
Is because the meaning and the political context of what the word liberal means has changed quite a bit since then. A modern political liberal in America is not the same as what liberal may have meant 200 years ago. So classical liberals refer to the political, social, and economic viewpoint that people know best what to do for themselves generally, and it's not the role of a sovereign or the role of a governor to command and tell people what to do, what types of economic activity to engage in, how to plant their crops, for example. They believe that these were decisions best left to individuals.
That's an important point to bring up, because Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence talks about all men are created equal. So equality at one level was very significant in classical liberal thought, and was rather radical probably at the time. The whole idea that the rulers, the kings and the others who ruled countries, really were no more morally superior to the average person who's being ruled in those countries. I mean, that part of equality was very, very radical, and a theme that was then taken up in the French Revolution as well, right?
Absolutely. You could trace it to Magna Carta in the English tradition. That was certainly a major influence on the founding fathers and classical liberals of the time. But it is around that time that there was a strong political movement around the idea that even the rulers should have to play by, should be the same under the law as the rest of the citizenry. And so the idea was that all citizens, and ultimately an extreme version of classical liberalism, would be all human beings are truly equal in the eyes of the law, equal in the eyes of God, as some of the founders would have put it, right? The idea is they're equal in that sense, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we're all corn farmers in Iowa. We all have very unequal outcomes. It doesn't mean we all end up married. It doesn't mean we have the same number of children. It doesn't mean we go to the same schools. It doesn't mean we wear the same clothes or drive the same cars. There's going to be quite a bit of inequality in terms of how people's lives turn out. But no matter how people's lives turn out, the ideal, which I'm sure is never fully realized, is that there is this equality of individuals under the law.
All right, so now let's turn into some of the contributions that the different authors that you've brought together are making to this volume. So let's get started here. What would be a good place to start?
I guess we will start with Steve Horowitz, who's at Ball State University. And
that's not Steve Horowitz.
This is not. This is not Dr. Horowitz. And Steve's chapter gets into a question. He relies on the economist Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist of the 20th century, who one of the many questions that Hayek was interested in was a question of what is the right kind of equality. And so and so Dr. Horowitz uses this as a jumping off point for exploring the question of what is the type of equality that matters, what is it that people care about. And he talks about fairness, but he definitely recognizes that the discussion about inequality and the concerns today that Americans have about inequality and potentially rising inequality, it's not just about fairness, it is a sense of what is going on. So go back to the Alabama example. A question is, if there were some evidence or some reason to believe that somehow something was going wrong, where they weren't being held to the same standard as other teams, where they weren't playing by the same rules, or maybe they had imagine stolen playbooks or other conspiracy theories like you see in sports sometimes, or in baseball one of them is stealing signs from the outfield, or there's sometimes there's a story of how someone is cheating, is breaking the rules to get ahead. And that's where Horowitz kind of focuses his analysis, is just how much of the observed inequality we see in American society today, and how much of the increase in inequality we may see at different times in history is due to just a natural pattern of growth and uneven results for people who pursue different goals, and how much of it is actually due to the fact that sometimes the rules of the game are rigged and not everyone is actually playing by the same rules.
And this is important, and the reason I have this quote from Churchill up there is that, the rules of the game that Hayek was talking about, the rules of the market order, were part of what was allowing all this prosperity, this unprecedented prosperity in human history to actually come about, right?
Yes. And so, and the root of that is a classical liberal norm, a new norm, and the U.S. was a great experiment in this, of bit by bit coming closer and closer to a society where people, regardless of their family name, regardless of their background, are more and more held to the same rules, viewed the same in court. And the result of that was tremendous economic growth and prosperity. And that's seen more and more in the world as institutions improve. In a sense, there's an equality that's improved, but you do definitely see unequal returns. In every case, poverty is alleviated. There's much less poverty, great reductions of poverty. That's happened especially in the last 20 years or so across the world, that there have been massive decreases in poverty. But at the same time, some people are able to do very, very well in that environment, whereas others are merely lifted out of poverty.
And I guess that's often when you see great wealth accumulated under the rules of the market, there's a temptation to think that if you could somehow just simply take that wealth from these people, from people like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, who have more money than they could seemingly possibly spend in 10 lifetimes, if you could just take that money and transfer it to some of the poorest people in Africa, you could alleviate a lot of suffering and maybe end poverty. And it's a tremendously, it seems so simple.
Right.
And yet, because you have these rules of the market order in place, it's not so simple, is it?
It's not so simple. And so the economic jargon is transfer payments and transfer programs, right? So what you're talking about is, it seems logically that there ought to be a way to transfer wealth and income from people who have more of it to people who have less of it without really doing much harm to the people who have more. And that's probably true, that it wouldn't necessarily do much harm to the people who have more. But there has to be some process for doing that. And this kind of gets us into another one of the chapters, which is the chapter by Peter Boettke, Rossellino, Candela, and Caitlin Woltz, which one of the things they point out is that when you try to correct inequality with a transfer program, so for example, the federal government spends about $3.8 trillion a year right now, and I think 2.4 to 2.5 trillion of that. So most of it is transfer programs that's spent on moving income or wealth from one person, or really from groups of people, to other groups of people. And yet when you drill down and look at the programs, the public finance economists have estimated that about 26% of that actually ends up in the hands of people who are poor, who have lower incomes and who have no wealth. And so what is going on? How is so much spent on a transfer program that ends up putting just a fraction of that transfer of those transfer payments into the hands of the people who need it? And the answer is, there are lots of people collecting a piece of it along the way. There are lots of people who have either set up rules of the game to advantage themselves, in other words, rigged the game in some way, or have come and found a rigged game and found a way to exploit it, who are able to collect large chunks of those transfer payments along the way before they ever reach the hands of the needy.
And again, I think it's worth emphasizing one more time. I mean, the disparities in income or wealth that emerge when people are trying to generate wealth and trying to lift people out of poverty, because I mean, England in the 1600s would have been as poor as Africa, perhaps, as some nations in Africa are today. I mean, I think you have to evaluate very differently the income disparities that come out of a system where people are trying to create wealth and it doesn't get created equally across the board, with one where kings or rulers are using the positions of power to enrich themselves.
Right. And unfortunately, that's our model, is we imagine modern day entrepreneurs who have been very successful. We often think of them the same way that we would think of royalty of the past, but there are a number of differences. One of the key differences is generally they haven't inherited it. It's a small percentage of these titans of industry who've inherited their wealth, or if they've inherited something, it's a very small fraction of what they've accumulated. Right. They've been able to accumulate wealth, or people who have high incomes have been able to reach high incomes because they have figured out ways to innovate and serve customers, serve other people better.
Now, I guess we want to get into this next chapter. You already mentioned the authors a little bit, but they all had another example that I think we wanted to bring up here, and I guess it goes back to libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick. And it's this Wilt Chamberlain example to show how you could look at some income disparities that emerge under these rules of the market and not necessarily find anything wrong there.
Right. Nozick, but also Boettke and his co-authors, they mentioned the Wilt Chamberlain, that's not necessarily something unjust, and that's, you may have a very equal set of rules in basketball and fairly equal set of rules, but because of Wilt Chamberlain's talent, but also the practice and the work ethic, he is naturally going to earn more than a lot of other people. And the economic reason he is going to earn so much more is because he's providing so much value to so many people. It's something that's, when you think about it, really hard to imagine. But when a star basketball player, today's version might be LeBron James, it might be Steph Curry, I don't know, right? But when someone is creating that much value and enjoyment for people, even if they're only catching a tiny, right? Even if they're only themselves receiving a tiny, tiny sliver of that, that's going to result in very, very high incomes and very rapid wealth accumulation. And is that a process that we would judge to be unfair? Do we believe that basketball is therefore unfair because some do so much better than others? For example, Wilt Chamberlain, right? Is there a way to equalize, to even the playing field between myself and Steph Curry? Well, I know, make him play one-handed, right? Maybe that would help, right? Right? Or maybe tie his shoelaces together, right? Those are ways to even out the outcome, to equalize the outcome. But is that really equality? Or would equality be, we play the game according to the same rules, but because I've spent far less time practicing my jump shot than he has, right? And I'm slower and shorter and a number of other things, I end up losing the contest very handily. That's the question of equality and where equality and fairness intersect.
And if it's the case that like Wilt Chamberlain or Steph Curry's earnings come from things like, well, lots of people like Steph Curry, so they go out and buy one of his jerseys.
Right.
And everybody who goes out and buys a jersey willingly pays for his jersey. And the end result of those thousands of transactions are our top athletes get paid lots of money. I mean, I think as Becky and his colleagues point out, well, at any one point along here, what was wrong? What seems to be so objectionable?
Right. I mean, the classical liberal way of viewing that is these were willing participants in the transaction. Anyone who bought a jersey or bought a ticket or subscribed to an NBA package over the internet or bought it with their cable package, everyone who in some way paid for the performance and the service that Steph Curry or LeBron James or Wilt Chamberlain provides, right? Anyone who willingly does that. They're a willing participant, and they're happy to do it. They value what they're getting more than they value the money they turn over. And so the question is what is wrong? And is it really a violation of some standard of equality when you think about it that way?
But there are some ways in which we could have some violations of the rules, and that might be some of what people are observing today and reacting negatively to. I mean, perhaps like the Occupy Wall Street protesters are onto something in terms of a violation of rules that the classical liberal perspective would still find problematic.
That's definitely true. And so the answer is what economists call rent-seeking, but what many others would call cronyism. And when you think about crony capitalism, what that involves is finding ways to use the law or use the legislative process, really, to create legal protection from competition. And if you can protect yourself from competition, you can earn higher profits. That's the basic idea. And does that happen? It happens in all areas of business pretty much. There are a reason there are so many lobbyists in Washington, D.C. You and I could talk at some point about, in a weird way, the mystery is why there isn't any more lobbying and why there isn't even more rent-seeking than we see. But it definitely is a real problem that you see, maybe in some industries more than others, but there are definitely people who have gotten rich, not by necessarily serving consumers better, but by making sure that legally no one else could serve consumers better.
And that's an important point as well, because a lot of times in this market process, it's inherently competitive in a way. And so if somebody comes along and does figure out a way to make a lot of money, people are going to imitate that. And so there's some element of the market that tends to equalize incomes over time naturally, right?
Yes. The thing is that there is, in the competitive process, if firms are allowed to compete with each other, if individuals are allowed to compete with each other, what you see is over time there's an equalization of returns. In other words, anyone making abnormal profits will see those profits eaten away. You will see a move towards equality. You'll see profits fall and fall and fall as competition continues its process. It's very rare to make long-term profits unless you have legally protected yourself somehow from competition. So if competition is allowed, then there is an equality at the end of the day, because abnormal profits go away. I mean, abnormally high profits.
Well, a final contribution we're going to talk about is from economist Don Boudreaux, and talks about the role of trade in possibly exacerbating inequality in society today. So what was his argument?
So he makes a very, very strong argument, which is, Don Boudreaux's argument in this chapter is that there are no losers from trade, right? There are in an important sense, and I agree with his argument, in an important sense there are not losers from trade. So we tend to say, well, there are winners and losers from trade. Obviously, when you allow more foreign competition into your market, when you allow foreign sellers into your market, consumers will be better off. That's pretty clear. Also, those foreign producers will be better off because they now have greater demand for their services and they have access to a bigger market. But domestic producers, potentially, if they're not able to be competitive in terms of features and cost, et cetera, they can potentially lose. That's the classic way of looking at it. Boudreaux's argument is that ignores the relevant time frame that you should be thinking about trade and competition. That if you think about trade and competition in the correct context and over an economically relevant time frame, as he says, then what you see is domestic producers, for example, domestic steel producers or domestic textile producers, they're only enjoying the standards of living they have now. They only have the consumers they have now and access to the markets they have now because of a system of relatively open trade. And everybody stands on the shoulders of giants, and everybody stands on the shoulders of generations before them. And there has been this continuous process of growing trade and greater specialization and more innovation. And that, Boudreaux argues, has only ever temporarily made people better off. But if you look at anyone alive today, they are much, much better off because of a system of open trade over time, because of a system of competition over time. And that process makes all of us better off. And if you look at the relevant time frame, a long enough time frame basically, there are no losers from trade. More than that, he argues, we take on the bargain, right? We all choose to go into relatively high risk, high reward occupations versus relatively lower risk and lower reward occupations. So for example, there's a lot more stability of income and much more job security when it comes to being, for example, a college professor, right? Versus the other extreme would be an entrepreneur who's introducing a completely new product. That person is taking on a lot of risk. They're going to have a relatively unstable income and relatively unstable prospects, but the rewards are potentially high. And we all kind of do this. We all take on some risk when it comes to our job security, and a trade-off between job security and how much we're going to earn, how stable our career is really going to be when we move into a career. The only thing is we obviously don't do this perfectly. It maybe didn't seem to anyone 200 years ago that being a horse trainer would become a boutique small occupation that very few people did. It certainly didn't seem that farming would be so small compared to now.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and talking about this, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.